Hey everyone, welcome back. It's May and I'm here with Gillian, and today we're going to be discussing some writing questions, I guess, that we've come across or just things we wanted to discuss. So feel free to continue the discussion in the comments when we're done if you have input on any of these things. Yeah, let's get into it. Gillian's going to read them.
Yes. So the first question that May and I were discussing was,
Sorry for removing it.
we may need to close that.
Why do you have to be testing your siren now?
Okay. So the first question is, we see something happen in the novel. How can a character have a conversation about that scene later without the story feeling repetitive? Have any thoughts?
Yeah, well, so this is something I've been running into a lot, and I don't have an answer because it's just something that I've been frustrated with, is something happens and then it seems logical that my main character would talk about it with her friends. So how do you write that without it seeming because the reader already knows, they already saw the thing. So do you just not put that, or do you summarize it? But what if it was an important scene that you still wanted there?
No, that makes sense. I think that my experience with this type of scenario is a little different because, as we were talking about, when you have, let's say it's an adventure movie, and you have the characters lay out the plan, generally you won't see the scene where they explain the plan. You'll see them say, okay, here's the plan, and then we cut to the next scene where we actually see the plan in action. The types of situations where you would see them go through the plan is if once we see them go through the scenario, if the plan goes terribly wrong. Because we need to understand why there's tension, because we are seeing things not go according to plan. Mm-hmm. So it's interesting and kind of difficult in a situation where it's the opposite, like you're saying. And I don't know, my inclination would be to try to not repeat it, if at all possible, or to repeat it in a fundamentally different way. Which is also something we've been talking about. You don't want to have an unreliable narrator in most instances, and if you do, it's very deliberate. Yeah. So you don't want to present the situation in a startlingly different way unless there's a clear purpose. Mm-hmm. However, you could have new information introduced during the scene where they talk about it. So maybe there was information we as the reader didn't see while it was happening. We didn't understand the importance of something until they talk about it later. Yeah. And then we finally see why this situation was good or bad or important.
Yeah. I don't know. I think I'm just gonna have to deal with it in my editing process, because I think that I might find that in some places it's not necessary and I can just cut it, or just summarize it and say I told so and so blah blah blah.
Yeah. All right, question number 2. How do you add tension to scenes that are necessary to move the plot along?
Yeah.
This is one of your questions, so explain a little bit what the scenario is here.
So it would be if you just needed your character to be at a certain setting, or have a certain other character in a scene with them for whatever reason, you hadn't seen them in that setting in a really long time, they needed to be at school or something, or there was another character that hadn't been in the novel for a really long time. And I know there's other things that I'm not thinking of, but I just had an instance where it was I knew we needed to see a character in between event A and event B. We couldn't just not have this character there. And I was able to work it in, but it's just hard when you don't know where, what to do with it, when there's not actual tension driving a scene, it just needs to be there.
Yeah, I think that tension is something that's always difficult for me to add, but I think significance to a scene is a little bit easier for me to address. In the novel that I'm working on right now, I've just been running into it where I had a similar scenario. I needed to have a character reappear, otherwise there would be too long of a gap between the times that we saw them. And so the way that I tend to write is more in small chunks. I'll write a conversation or some internal thought process or something like that. And so I've gotten into the habit of combining those scenes. So when I knew that I needed this character to reappear, I had it in my notes that I just needed to write a scene with this character. And when I got to that point in the plot, I realized that there was no significance to this scene other than me just shoving the character back into the story. So I had to combine 2 different scenes to make it one significant scene. So it made my scene a little longer, which in most instances for me is good. I tend to write really short scenes. But it also allowed the scene to be more complex because not only are we having this character come back, but it also allowed me to combine it with more of an internal thought process of my main character. And so the 2 things could kind of function at the same time in the scene. So I didn't feel like I needed to heighten the tension because the significance was there.
Yeah. So I feel like in the instance like I was talking about, it's good to just fit it in, like combine it with something else, like not write a separate scene just for that character.
Yeah. All right, this one's a fun one. What are some good ways to give a physical description of your narrator in first person? This one's really hard for me because I don't generally write first person. And the novel I'm working on right now is one of my first attempts at long form first person, so it's been difficult.
Yeah, and you have like all your different points of view.
Yeah, 6 different points of view. So in my first character's point of view, I can kind of give some insight into how the other characters look, some of them, but not all of them. So I don't know, what are some ways that you know of? Because you write a lot in first person.
Yeah, I don't know that I'm doing it right though. I honestly can't remember. I think I use the mirror too much. Because I know you're like not supposed
looking
to do
in the
that
mirror.
Where it's like too cliche. But I have seen it used before. I've read books before where it's like they mention that they have certain features of one of their parents. Like if one of their parents like comes into the scene or like one of their siblings, they would either compare themselves, like say like what they had similar or like completely different to them.
Yeah, I like the comparative method because it tells you not only about the protagonist or the speaker, but it also tells you about another character. So it's the example of them holding up a photograph and assessing a photograph of their grandmother or their aunt or their mother, who they look like. And then other things are, a family member, like you said, walks in and they compare their features. I've seen some instances where people talk about, like, I grabbed my brown ponytail. I have to say I don't like that method.
Yeah.
But it is something that people do.
I think in the book I'm writing right now, I did mention her hair by having her pull it up into a ponytail. But it was like for a reason, okay? It wasn't like she was just pulling it up to a ponytail. It was like, it made sense that she was pulling it up to a ponytail.
Yeah.
And in my other book, she had just gotten her hair done before coming back to school, so her friends were like commenting on it, so that was a little bit easier.
So that's good if like someone else commenting on a change in their appearance, maybe. Like for me, eye color is not important. I don't care about what a character's eye color is, but the length of their hair matters a lot to me because the length of your hair is a choice that you make. You can't choose what color your eyes are,
True.
But it tells you something about the character, how they choose to cut and style their hair.
Like I see your point about that, like hair matters more. And I feel like I don't think about eye color. I get like annoyed when authors keep bringing up the eye color. It's like, and like when they try to say it in like different ways.
Yeah.
But I feel like I'd want to know what the main character's eye color was. Maybe not other characters, but I just want like a full picture of them.
So this is kind of similar question. At what point in the novel should the reader have a clear image of the main characters? Like, I like to use percentages, like 5% into the novel, 12%.
But I can't think in percentages. I feel like I have to think in chapters.
Chapters, okay. Well, then you can talk in chapters.
I feel like, because you had talked about like how you can split up the main character's description. You don't have to.
I tend to be one that splits up the main character's description. So I'll give you one detail, and then in the next scene a couple more details, and a couple more details. But I feel like in general, my goal is about 10% into the novel to have the general image of my main character there, as much as I'm revealing to them.
I feel like I'd want it to be sooner.
Okay.
Personally, because like at that point I'd be like we're getting like another characteristic. I feel like that's too far in.
So are you like
I don't know. I feel like
in the first 5 pages or like first 10 pages?
Yeah, like within the first chapter or two.
Okay, so first chapter. I feel maybe if we're going by chapters, again, I tend to write shorter chapters, but I would say maybe chapter 3. By the end of chapter 3, I'd want to know.
That's fair. Yeah.
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 All right.
Because like it's important to know what they look like. You want to know who you're picturing doing all these things.
Yeah, I agree. But so what details are important to you? Like if you had to pick 3 things to know about the character you're reading about.
Is hair one or hair color and length separate?
You can just say hair is one.
Okay, hair, build, and skin, I guess.
I think for me, it's hair and the way that they dress. Because again, that's a personality choice.
Oh, I didn't know that was part of it.
See, for me, again, the things that they're born with don't matter as much to me as the choices that they make. So for me, I would want to know their hair, specifically how it's cut or styled, and the choice of clothing. Like,
Yeah.
do they wear all black? Do they never wear combat boots? Do they only wear military cut jackets? Like, you know,
Yeah.
things like that.
I feel like I actually focus too much on how characters dress. That's because I care. Like in other books, I like never get bored if it says on this day this character is wearing
Yeah.
this. Like I always want to know because it helps me picture them. Like I can picture what they're wearing, and I get that like it makes more sense if it's just like for a special occasion to show like a difference in how they're dressing. But I wouldn't mind like knowing it in almost every scene.
Yeah.
I don't know.
All right. Okay, and then the last question is, how do you keep dialogue realistic and interesting at the same time? So your dialogue
Your backstory on
can't
this.
be too realistic that it's pointless, but it can't be too snappy that it sounds scripted.
Yeah.
So for instance, I would never want to read a book where the dialogue runs a little bit like this. Hey, how are you today? I'm good. That's good. Because let's face it, this is what a lot of our conversations in real life are like, and I would
Yeah.
never want to read about that in a book. But at the same time, I've had people tell me that my dialogue is too snappy and too scripted, and that it doesn't sound realistic. So my question is, how do you find that balance?
Yeah, I feel like I probably verge on too realistic because you can't have characters like not greet each other. I don't know. I feel like I do that too much, and again, I'll probably cut it. But I always try to like start it with them greeting each other, saying like, "How was your weekend?" And sometimes like what they say is significant or like tells you something about them still with that. I think having characters like interrupt each other or trail off sometimes helps because that definitely happens in real life. Like you can't write it like a real conversation where people will just change their train of thought mid-sentence because the reader would just like get confused. But like I feel like in a normal conversation people will like trail off, interrupt each other, things like that. But I don't know, like making it not too witty is hard.
Yeah.
Because like especially if that's how your character's supposed to be.
Right.
So like I feel like that's another thing. Like some people really maybe would kind of talk like that.
Yeah. I think a big thing for not making it sound so scripted is that most people in real life don't speak in full sentences. They'll stop their sentence halfway through and start another one.
Yeah.
And so making sure that your dialogue isn't grammar perfect is, I think, a good way to help with that.
Yeah.
When it comes to character introductions, I try to keep them as short as possible. So if one character says hello, then another character will respond with something else rather than just echoing hello. Even if that's not how it really happens in real life, I think a reader would appreciate that the conversation's moving along and the mutual greeting is implied. Another tip that I was told by a creative writing professor is that people generally don't say what they mean. And so I think a good way to have characters still say witty things but not make it sound so picture perfect scripted is to have them respond in an unexpected way, to say something that not necessarily is super cryptic but just taking the conversation a different direction, because that's what we tend to do in real life. And then something from my time studying journalism that I think has helped me is when you interview someone, you never ask yes or no questions. You always ask open-ended questions. And so I've started writing to the point where my characters ask each other open-ended questions.
Yeah.
So that they can never just answer with yes or no. Because then you're constantly, your conversation is going to be more like a tennis match where it's constantly going back and forth. You never want that ball to stop and have to be picked up again because that makes the scene slower. So I think that that's one way to really keep that going. And that also kind of plays into characters not saying exactly what they mean. It's like responding to a question with an answer that sort of answers the question but sort of takes the conversation in a different direction.
Yeah. Yeah, no, those are good ideas. I'm definitely gonna use the not mutual greeting one because that would cut some words. It could just be like, "Hey, how was your weekend?" instead of "Hey, what's your weekend?"
Yep.
Like one of them could be taken out. I should Control F hey.
There you go. It may smooth out some of those dialogue tag or action problems in conversations.
I feel like the hardest part for me, like I don't feel like my dialogue usually feels scripted. Maybe it does to other people, but to me it does seem pretty natural, except when I have a character telling a story or explaining something. And I ran into this in like one of my short story classes when it was like this really like emotionally tense scene and people were like, this sounds way too smooth, like your main character needs to like stumble over her words and like have pauses and everything not come out perfectly. And that really stuck with me for like something that's emotionally heightened like that. But if it's not, it's like it just seems like I just took text that I would have written and put quotes around it.
Right.
I don't know.
Which I think is even harder when you're writing in first person, because then the tone and voice are automatically similar. In the book that I'm writing right now, for instance, I had a situation where the mother is needing to tell a story to her daughter, and the story is supposed to be, I don't want to call it a parable, but it's supposed to be symbolic in a way, or kind of a metaphor for something. It sounded really awkward that I wrote out this whole story and it sounded really polished, and then I just sort of dropped it in there, and it doesn't fit with any of the mother's other dialogue. Her other dialogue sounds fairly natural, and this sounds really scripted. And it's difficult because she's not trying to convey to her daughter or the reader necessarily the exact events of the story, the thing that took place. Although the exact events are listed, the main thing is to get the feel of what the story means. And so that was what I was really trying to embody, and therefore I couldn't split it up into a bunch of lines of dialogue. It had to be one cohesive story. And so I really am struggling with how to make that sound realistic.
And like, would the other character like ask questions or anything, or would they not do that?
So in most situations, that's how I would do it. But in this scenario, I can't, especially since this is supposed to be a broken relationship between the mother and her daughter. And so the daughter is very reverent of this because her mother's actually opening up for the first time. And so the daughter doesn't want to interrupt her. So.
Yeah, that's hard. And like, she wouldn't like stumble over her words or anything, or like,
probably not, because she's a very polished person.
Did you put an action in it?
So I did split it up with a couple actions.
That's probably the best you can do.
But it's still just the wording of it. It's already so long just telling the story, and so if I try to make it sound more realistic, all I'll be doing is adding more words. And I don't want to make the story any longer, because right now it sounds so polished because she's only using the exact words that she needs to convey the message. So if I added more of her stumbling, then it would get longer to the point where the reader would say, okay, flip the page, where is this going?
So that's like specific, but I think in general, ways to make it like more realistic, or maybe to have someone interrupt and like ask questions about it. Like, there are definitely times where they wouldn't do that. Like, if they are, like if it's like a really significant situation, but they're opening up to them, like they don't want to interrupt them, like that's definitely something that would happen. But like if it's a little kid or something, they could be asking questions while they tell the story, or anyone. But
I know that's great when there's kids involved, because kids ask a lot of questions. And that can help you refocus your story. If you feel like the story the person's telling starts getting off of your initial theme, having another character, especially a child, ask a very basic question will bring it back to that central theme. All right, and then our last question is regarding info dumps. So talking about when you need to provide important information to the reader, do you use exposition or dialogue? I've heard some people say that info dumps should completely stay out of dialogue, that you should never use dialogue as an info dump space. And then other people say that exposition is a bad place for an info dump, that you should only convey information through dialogue. So that's kind of two sides of it. The kind of main situation that I can think of in kind of everyday art and entertainment is film. Very often you have a character arrive in a new situation or at a new place, and another character will talk and introduce them to it. So you have a character arrive at a new school, and the other character will tell them about the school and events and things like that. Because in film, you don't have the ability to have the exposition. You can use visual images and things like that, but you don't have the place that we do while we're writing, where we actually can write out in exposition those details. So it's the question of, how do you find that balance? How do you put some of the information into the dialogue and some of it into exposition, and when is it appropriate? Any thoughts about that?
Well, I just want you to go over what you did, because I don't want to steal it. You came up with it.
So because I write historical fiction, I think one easy example of this has to do with, let's take wartime as an example. If you have two characters that are living through a war, they're experiencing the rations and the home front and all of that every day, they're not going to be talking to each other about the basics of how that works. They're not going to say things like, don't you know there's a war on? It's going to be something that's implied and understood, and the conversation, I think, is going to be much more nuanced versus if it was a grandmother who lived through the war talking to her granddaughter 30 years later, she would maybe have to convey those basic things about living through a war. So that would become a little different. And so I think the main rule is always think about what your character knows and what your reader knows. So if a character comes to a new school and they're talking to someone who's been at that school for a while, then your character is just as oblivious as your reader. Both of them don't know about this school. And so then your character who's been at the school can tell both the other character and your reader at the same time the basics of what they need to know. So always think about if it's something that your characters both know, but your reader doesn't, use exposition. If it's something that both your reader and your character don't know, use dialogue.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I feel like it helps to split up the info dump if you're doing it in exposition. I mean, really either way, because you don't really want like a big long thing of dialogue either. Because like my first novel that I tried to write, it was like an actual disaster. I had like each chapter started with like a page long data dump. And when I went through, I mean, I started this in high school, guys, okay? So like don't judge me too hard. I really had to work on that, and I had to connect it. Like it wasn't even connected to like where it should be. Like it was just there. Like, so this probably sounds really basic. Like it needs to be like prompted by something. Like don't just have it come out of the blue. Like have maybe something that another character mentions.
Yeah.
Have it like be part of that, or like I had this one thing about like all my main characters' dietary restrictions that was like it didn't make any sense. Well, instead of just listing all of her dietary restrictions, I kind of inputted them in a couple different places. Like I said what she was eating when she went out to eat with her friends, what she had to order, and then when I told a story, there was a time when she got really sick from eating something in that story.
So you presented problems or situations that would reveal it to the reader.
Yeah.
The way when I'm writing historical fiction and I run into a lot of those scenarios where the characters know things but the reader doesn't and I have to use exposition, I tend to use images to convey those things. For instance, I'll have a photograph or an object in the room that I will describe, something about the scene, the situation, that will hint at the circumstances that the characters are in to the reader without me just saying, there's a war on and this is happening. You can use those little images and objects and scenery pieces to convey that in a much more subtle way.
Alright, I think that is going to be it for this video, so please, like I said, continue the discussion in the comments. I would love to hear your guys' input on anything that we talked about. Thank you so much for watching. I make videos every Monday, and I will see you next time. Please like and subscribe. Bye!
Bye!